Welcome back to UC Davis Live COVID-19. I'm Satirius Johnson. If you're a pet owner sheltering at home, you've probably been spending a lot more time than usual with your animal companions. So what's the impact of COVID-19 on dogs, cats, and other animals? Are they susceptible to the virus? And what can we learn from diseases, especially in cats, that we might apply to people? Joining me today to talk about these issues are two UC Davis veterinarians who specialize in infectious diseases. Jane Sykes is Chief Veterinary Medical Officer of the UC Davis Veterinary Medical Teaching Hospital, also an Associate Dean at the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. As a clinician and researcher, she specializes in infectious diseases of dogs and cats. And Niels Peterson is Professor Emeritus at the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. His research career is focused on viruses that cause diseases in cats. These include coronaviruses in the same general family as COVID-19, which can cause a disease called feline infectious peritonitis, and he's been involved in trials of experimental drugs to treat coronavirus in cats. Welcome to you both, and thank you for coming on today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Satirios.
Thank you. Yes, before we get started, I just wanted to remind viewers that this is a free webcast. You can watch it live. You can also watch it after the live broadcast on the UC Davis Facebook page, Twitter, and YouTube channels. We're aware of others posting links saying that you have to pay to watch this video. Please do not click on those links. This is a free webcast. And we're also taking audience questions. So if you're watching us live, just leave them in the comments section and we'll work in as many as we can. Let's start with you, Jane. The big question for a lot of pet owners is, can my dog or cat get COVID-19? What's the latest thinking on that?
Yeah, so certainly there are now many examples of cats and dogs becoming infected with the SARS coronavirus 2. It's not clear to what extent animals can really be sick with that virus in the field. There's been some experimental infection studies done that have shown development of a respiratory illness. But many of the cases that have been reported in the field have had other conditions as well. So it's difficult to know just to what extent that virus is causing disease in people's pets. But these are really quite uncommon infections given the scope of this infection worldwide in people. Very, very rare numbers of dogs and cats that have been reported to be infected.
So if an animal has COVID-19, you're basically implying that there's no evidence that they can transmit it to other animals, say like at a dog park or even maybe giving it to their owners.
That's right. And so we know that dogs and cats are getting it from human exposure, and there's been no documented transmission back to people. That the only reported transmission to other animal species have been in the mink, in mink farms. So in Europe, the European mink farms that have had, thousands of mink affected, there's been transmission there, but not from people's pets onto other pets or back to people.
So what are some simple precautions to take with your pet if you end up being sick, or if you end up having a sick pet? What should people be doing?
Yeah, so if you are sick and you're diagnosed with COVID-19, then the CDC recommends taking the same precautions with your animals that you would be taking with other people in your home. In other words, you'd be wearing masks. You'd be trying to minimize close contact with your animals. You wouldn't want to sleep in the bed with your animals or have them lick you in the face, those types of contacts, and just basic precautions that you should take in a normal household situation. So washing your hands after handling your pets and so forth.
Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of, accessories that go with pets. Has anyone ever come up with a mask for pets or even would that even work? I mean,
yeah. And so actually some of the very early pictures, the very first dog that was reported to be infected in Hong Kong, that was a geriatric Pomeranian. Another example of a dog that died after being diagnosed with infection, but likely died from heart disease because it was a 17-year-old Pomeranian that had advanced heart disease. There were pictures of that dog wearing a mask early on, but masks are not effective when put on animals, and so that's not recommended.
Right.
And again, no evidence that animals can transmit the infection back to people, so really not required.
Not necessary. Niels, you've studied coronaviruses that actually infect cats. How similar are these viruses to SARS-CoV-2, otherwise known as COVID-19, and how do they differ?
Well, the there's one species of coronavirus in cats, and that's called feline coronavirus. It's an alpha coronavirus, which is a large group that has other mammalian coronaviruses that infect other species. The COVID virus and the SARS and MERS viruses are what are called beta coronaviruses. So they're in a different species or different group of viruses, but they share 70–80% of their genomes like coronavirus, but in different areas, especially in the attachment proteins and some of the accessory proteins, they differ a little, but they have similarities. And interestingly, as far as the proteins that are involved with replication, the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, some of the proteases and that, these tend to be shared a lot more between all of the coronaviruses, even with some relationship to other RNA viruses altogether. So the family of coronaviruses, it has a lot of relationship. And, evolutionarily, these viruses, at least the mammalian ones, seem to originate in the reservoir of the bats. And bats have many, many coronavirus species. Each type of bat has its own species. Some of them have several. And a lot of the coronaviruses, if you trace them back that we have in our pet species and our livestock, have originated somewhere in bats, and then they often jump into some intermediate host, like SARS was into civet cats that were eaten in the meat market, wild meat market. MERS was intermediate host, jumped into camels and then into people. And then the best evidence is that COVID was in pangolins in the meat market and then jumped into people. So these viruses have a long history of changing species. And even in the dog, the coronavirus of dogs, the enteric coronavirus of dogs, which has been known for a long time, within the last decade, a new respiratory coronavirus appeared, which is a beta coronavirus, whereas the original dog enteric coronavirus is more closely related to the cat virus and is an alpha coronavirus. And then we've had recently, in the last decade or so, new coronaviruses appear in swine. There's a Delta coronavirus, which is related to the avian viruses. So these viruses love to recombine and switch hosts, and often go from one into an intermediary and then into a host. But the point being is that once they establish themselves in a host, they are very host specific. They don't jump back and forth. So there are no coronavirus species that we know of that is in one species, like a cat that infects dogs and people and so forth. None of the dog coronaviruses don't infect people or cats, and the swine coronaviruses don't infect people, dogs, or cats. And so once they establish themselves, they become very species specific. And this is the pattern with COVID-19. It is destined to be the fifth major coronavirus that exists in humans. It will be a new coronavirus, but as I said, there are 4 others that have evolved over the last 100 years or so or more. So there will be more.
When it comes to the domestic animals, though, when we're talking like dogs and cats and other animals that people, might keep as pets, how many of these viruses are there?
How many coronaviruses?
How many of these types of coronaviruses are there in domestic animals?
Well, almost every species of domestic animal has its coronavirus, and some of them have a couple of them. As I said, the dog has an enteric coronavirus, an alpha type, and a beta respiratory coronavirus. They all have them. Pigs, horses, cows, all the animals that I'm aware of have their own little iterations of coronavirus.
And again, not all coronaviruses are as, severe as COVID-19. I mean, the common cold is believed to be a coronavirus as well, right?
Oh, no, the general pattern for coronaviruses is they're either respiratory, that basically cause mild upper respiratory infections, cold, bronchitis, that type of thing, or enteritis, diarrheas. But they're very species adapted. There's a kind of an old saying among virologists that viruses do not like to kill their hosts, and they don't even like to make them sick. They would just as soon live very happily among us and not do anything. And so this is the pattern of all of these viruses. Once they come into a species, they tend to cause a little excitement, a little disease, but then they attenuate themselves, they gain infectivity and lose virulence, and they adapt themselves. And so the suspect is that COVID-19 is on its way already. There are mutations occurring already which have influenced both infectivity and virulence. So this is an it's not exciting, it's not fun to go through, but nonetheless, it's a learning lesson. What we're seeing is the emergence of a new species of virus that has jumped ship from one host through an intermediary and into us. And this is nothing new. New viruses occur all the time. Remember in the 70s, the panleukopenia virus somehow shifted and got into dogs and caused the parvovirus infection in dogs. And that was really bad at first, but then it now is in and only causes disease under certain circumstances.
We are taking audience questions, so if you're watching us live, just leave them in the comment section and we'll work in as many as we can. We do have a question from AJ, who's watching on Facebook, asking, can the virus be transferred when an infected person pets your dog? Can it live on fur? What do we know about that?
Yeah, that's been a common question. And actually, no one's really studied specific persistence of the virus on fur, but hair is a very porous material, and it's thought to be quite similar to cardboard. So if any virus does contaminate the hair coat, it's not likely to survive on the hair coat for a very long period of time, in the order of less than an hour. So you would have to have significant contamination, and the transmission is mostly through direct contact among humans. And again, no evidence that a pet could transmit the infection that way.
We have another question. Sapna on Facebook is asking, what are the symptoms in dogs we should be looking for? Should we be looking for symptoms if we can't, if it's not transferable to humans?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a companion animal health standpoint, we still do suspect that this virus may be able to cause respiratory and potentially gastrointestinal illness in dogs and cats. And so you'd be looking for signs of respiratory illness, like, I think difficulty breathing or diarrhea and vomiting. Certainly those signs have been reported in animals that have been infected. But as I said before, there's several examples of cases where they've had other concurrent conditions that could be causing those signs as well. But from a coronavirus standpoint and the types of signs that coronaviruses cause in dogs and cats, it would be runny nose, runny eyes, fever, diarrhea, those types of signs.
Have there been any cases, any documented deaths in pets from coronavirus?
There was a death reported recently in a dog from North Carolina, but we still don't have necropsy results from that dog to know whether it truly died. The other deaths that have been reported, they've all found some other significant disease that can cause death in dogs and cats at necropsy.
Another viewer question. Dottie on Facebook is asking, how can pets get COVID-19 from us, but not pass it on to humans?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it may be in part related to the amount of virus that's actually shed by dogs and cats in the field. So that's probably the most likely reason, is that they don't shed very much and not enough to infect people.
Niels, I wanted to ask you, you've recently been involved with studies of drugs to treat coronavirus disease in cats. Could these drugs also be used in people, or can they be adapted to be used in people?
Well, this is actually quite the controversy because we've actually studied two drugs that have been able to successfully treat the feline infectious peritonitis form of feline coronavirus infections. The first one was a drug from Kansas State University that we collaborated with them on. It's called a protease inhibitor. That was very successful. And then our the last one was 2 or 3 years ago. We collaborated with Gilead on some of their compounds. And we actually hit upon one of the compounds that's closely related to remdesivir, and that actually is the active ingredient of remdesivir. The compound was called GS-441524, a big name, so we'll just kind of call it GS. And that one was even even more effective than the protease inhibitor. Unfortunately, Gilead had made a decision. They changed their mind in the process, and basically when we showed them that this could be very effective in cats to treat this disease, they basically decided not to grant animal rights right away for the compound, because they were worried that it would interfere with their ability to continue their research and discovery and eventual marketing and approval of remdesivir. The compounds are so closely related that they were worried that if they were to approve an animal drug that's related to remdesivir, that it would cause problems. And so what happened is the chemical companies in China, who are very good at synthesizing any compound that we could possibly make and offering it on the unapproved or black market. The Chinese have a lot of pet cats. It's a big problem. FIP is a big problem in China. And so they basically started, they saw an opportunity. They saw both a need and opportunity, and started manufacturing GS and selling it on the unapproved market for cat owners to treat their cats for FIP. There have been now, in the last year and a half or 2 years, over 15,000 cats worldwide that have been treated with GS-441524. And recently, there's been a lot of criticism of Gilead for not moving forward on both drugs, on the GS-441524 as well as remdesivir. And GS-441524 actually has advantages over remdesivir because it's much simpler to synthesize. There's only 3 major synthetic steps for GS, and there's 7 for remdesivir. So it would be much cheaper to make, and then there's all these Chinese companies that are already making it. So there are places that you can get it, and so actually Gilead has been kind of not very keen on doing that, on testing GS-441524 against COVID. But there have been studies in monkeys and other species showing it to be very effective against the COVID virus and related coronaviruses. So my understanding is that there are several organizations now that are actually moving forward to do their own field trials on GS-441524 to show, to prove that it may be both cheaper and more effective than remdesivir. Now, the other drug, the protease inhibitor from Kansas State, that patent was bought by a company called Anavive. And recent studies have shown that that drug is actually the most effective protease inhibitor known against COVID virus. So here was a cat studies that showed a protease inhibitor called GC376 that was even more effective than any of the known protease inhibitors. So that, my understanding is that will be going forward in field trials in Canada as well. So there are 2 drugs that were studied and used in cats very successfully that are now being on the brink of being tested for COVID-19
And that would be in humans you're talking about.
in humans. Yes.
Right. Okay. We have another question. Robert on Facebook is asking, are there any activities I should avoid with my dog to lessen exposure to the coronavirus?
So I think I can take that one. I think we want people to enjoy, especially at this quarantine time, the human animal bond. And things like, walking your dog and so forth are all great activities to participate in. I think really what you want to be doing is just doing physical distancing as you would normally be doing. You don't want to get close to people and spend time with them while they're petting your dog, just because it's more the risk of getting exposed to the coronavirus from those other people. So just the routine precautions that have been recommended are all that's required.
I mean, if you take your dog, say, to a dog park, do you want to let your dog go over to other people and have other people pet them? I mean, it almost sounds like if humans are giving it to pets, maybe you want to keep your pets isolated from other humans.
It's probably a low risk of transmission if it's a very brief period of contact when a dog runs over to another person and is patted by them. But again, I think that you want to be avoiding like large gatherings of people just for your own health as well.
Right. Jessica, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I might add one thing is that the way dogs are kept now is basically not much different than people are being kept in this pandemic. The rules that we follow, you realize that dogs are usually walked on leashes. There are dog parks where people will go only if they know the other dogs that are in their group. So they're already doing these little grouping kind of thing. And so, and most of the dogs stay indoors when they're not outdoors, and when they're outdoors, they're on a leash. And so when you figure it, dogs have been under quarantine for a long, long time. And of course, if you look at cats, the indoor cats are just indoors. And so their only risk is from infected people. And so who else are they going to infect if they're indoors? Because the risk for anybody coming in is from the people, not from the cat, and if they're an indoor-outdoor cat, the outdoor cats stay in local areas. They have their own territories and their own friends and contacts, and and the outdoor population basically stays away from people as much as possible. So they're in their own little quarantine kind of a situation naturally. So it's us humans that are the social beasts that have parties and don't care who we're doing it with, and in fact encourage meeting other people and all that. So the way we live, we're at high risk naturally. So it's kind of a funny thing when people talk about doing all of these procedures to keep the disease from their cats and dogs and from spreading it to humans. If you get thinking about it, it's almost a little humorous, if I could use that word.
Blame it on the humans. We have another question. Jessica on Facebook is asking to please comment on the potential for vaccines developed for SARS-CoV-2 to cause an antibody-dependent enhancement effect, similar to what happened with some vaccines developed for feline FIP, feline, was it the infectious?
Peritonitis.
Peritonitis, yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'll handle that one, I guess. Yeah, it's a real possibility because antibody-dependent enhancement is seen in several RNA virus infections. It's in FIP is one of the prime examples of that, where there are two types of immunity. There's antibody-related immunity, and then there's cell or T-cell lymphocyte-related immunity. And there's a balance between those two. And if the balance goes towards antibodies, it can actually accelerate and make the disease worse, and which is the case for FIP. So protective immunity in FIP is not antibodies, it's T cells. So it is a risk that people are taking. There is a worry about that. People have mentioned it as something to be worried about. It may not affect every person that's vaccinated, but it may affect 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, and end up causing very severe disease, like the relationship of dengue fever and dengue hemorrhagic fever. That's another disease where antibody dependent enhancement is in an important part, and which makes vaccination very difficult. So yeah, there's a worry out there, and there are some people that that refuse to be vaccinated because there is a worry. I don't know if it's a big worry or not, and it's one of those things that you can only find out by doing it. I suspect that vaccines won't do it to everybody, but they may do it to 1 out of 1,000 or 1 out of 10,000, and you'll only find that out by vaccinating 1 million people.
Hmm.
So it is a possibility. It is known in coronaviruses, and it is a possibility.
What are some of the other domestic or companion animals that might be infected with coronavirus, with COVID-19 anyway? Are horses susceptible? Can birds get it? Reptiles? What do we know about that?
Yeah, so actually
Yeah,
also,
go ahead.
I wanted to go back also to that question about, if we could pass it to pets, why can't pets pass it back to us? I would also say that in that situation, these animals that have been reported to be infected have been in households that have, 1 or 2 people in them that actually also have COVID-19. So there's not actually been the opportunity for these animals often to pass it on to another person because there's already infected people in the household. That's how they got it. And then those animals are not being exposed to others. But there was one on the line of other species, there was one paper preprint that actually just came out. And we know that, ferrets are like mink, and ferrets are susceptible to SARS coronavirus infection, the first SARS coronavirus. And, there was some concern about the susceptibility of ferrets to SARS coronavirus 2 infection, and especially with all the mink that are related species that got infected as well. And ferrets have been shown to be infected experimentally and easily infected and develop signs and actually pass the infection onto other in-contact ferrets. But there was a study that just came out from Tufts where they studied a household that had a lot of ferrets in the household in contact with 2 people, both that had symptomatic COVID-19, and they were, quite sick. And one of them was handling the ferrets every day and actually collected samples from all of the ferrets in this household every day and had close exposure to those ferrets. None of the ferrets became infected despite that close contact. And there have been studying, potential mutations that may have occurred in the virus that actually means that natural infections of ferrets may be quite unlikely. So it's just kind of it's only 1 household, 1 paper, and they didn't show that during the period that the ferrets were sampled, they didn't actually test the people at the same time. So we don't know whether they were actually truly shedding at that time. But ferrets is one species, but that was just an interesting observation. And I'll let Niels comment on the other animal species.
Well, horses have their own coronavirus. It can cause enteritis or diarrheas, but it's pretty uncommon. If you get the right circumstances, the right exposure level, the right horse, and so forth and so on, you can see a little disease, but it's very self-limiting, and seldom, if ever, is it serious. So we don't worry about coronaviruses and horses really, as it's kind of an interesting afterthought, but they do have their own coronavirus. Cows have their own coronaviruses, and it's mainly causes diarrhea in calves, young calves, especially if the calves are deprived of colostrum. They're weaned from their mothers before they take colostrum, and they're bucket fed. This type of thing, it can cause quite severe diarrhea on occasion, but again, that's usually managed by feeding colostrum to the calves that are taken from their mothers. We also see it in swine. It's a very important disease in swine. where it causes diarrhea, enteritis, but it's again more important in baby swine in the first 2 weeks of life. If they're infected, get a massive exposure, they can get very sick and have a very high mortality. But after they reach 5 or 7 weeks of age, they become progressively more resistant, and you see basically very mild disease, if anything. And most swine operations, there are several swine coronavirus species out there. New ones pop up every once in a while, and mutations occur in the existing ones, which can change the immunogenicity of them and that type of thing. But they're controlled mainly by keeping most all swine production now is in massive facilities that are out in the nature somewhere, way far from population centers, and they're strictly quarantined. So now poultry, avian bronchitis, the coronavirus in poultry, infectious bronchitis virus, a number of strains of that. It is also an important cause of upper respiratory disease. And again, in young poultry and poults and chicks and that, it can cause quite severe disease. But its biggest problem actually is in laying hens, where it can cause a mild or asymptomatic disease, but also infect the reproductive tract and cause a precipitous drop in egg production. So it has a more important role in poultry, not as a cause of severe disease and death in young chickens, but mainly in the laying population. And but again, poultry operations are huge. They're strictly quarantined. So both in swine and poultry, the idea is to raise these animals in a very strict quarantine situation, so you don't have to deal with the nuances of vaccination and outbreaks and epizootics and all of this type of stuff.
Right.
So, you could go right down the list. The disease in ferrets is interesting because ferrets have their own coronavirus. It is the wild type is an enteric type coronavirus. It's distantly related to the cat virus. But interestingly, ferrets also can have mutations in their common coronavirus that can lead to a disease that's very similar, in fact, almost identical to feline infectious peritonitis. So there's a parallel in ferrets between their enzootic enteric coronavirus and its ability to mutate and to form this highly fatal disease called ferret infectious peritonitis or feline infectious peritonitis.
We do have some other questions from our audience. Debbie on Facebook is asking, if I guess this goes to either of you, have you treated dogs with COVID and did they survive?
We have not had any dogs with coronavirus, with SARS coronavirus infection at UC Davis Teaching Hospital.
Okay. Jeannie on Facebook is asking, what agencies are monitoring coronavirus in companion animals? For instance, are necropsies on coronavirus suspected deaths mandated by local public health agencies? How are the data being compiled and who is doing the compiling? Is any of that happening?
Yeah. So the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, so APHIS, is keeping track of cases that are reported in the United States. And so they document all of them on their website, and the World Health Organization, OIE, as well as is also tracking animal cases.
But Jane, has it been declared a reportable disease? So if a veterinarian has a case that they suspect has coronavirus or an owner, is it something that should be brought to the attention of the authorities?
Yeah, and in fact, any testing of animals for SARS coronavirus 2 has to be done in conjunction with local public health authorities, and test results have to be validated using a recognized laboratory. So all of any testing done, and there's guidance for testing and what situations to actually test. animals for SARS coronavirus 2, and there's guidance from public health authorities, and they have to be involved in that process.
Becky is watching on Facebook. She's asking, if COVID-19 made it to our food chain, could the meat or eggs spread the virus to consumers?
Well, I mean, there's no evidence of that in the food chains with either the avian or the swine coronavirus, or even the bovine. So there's been no evidence for food chain contamination for those agents, as far as I know, in species of animals that are used for food.
We have another question. Sapna on Facebook is asking, if my pet does contract the virus and does recover, will there be internal damage left behind as humans have to lungs, brain, etc.? Do we have any data on that?
So like I said, there's actually not good evidence that natural infections are associated with illness in dogs and cats, and we don't know the true extent to which the virus can cause disease in dogs and cats. And there's certainly evidence of animal infections, dog and cat infections, where no signs have been present, and the dog has just been positive for the virus, like an asymptomatic carrier in people, very similar, but we use the word subclinical because animals don't feel symptoms. So again, right now, no evidence that the virus is capable of causing severe disease. And there's been some, suggestions out there that different species may be more susceptible. Say maybe cats are more likely to get sick than dogs, or cats may be more likely to become infected than dogs. But there's just so few cases that have been described in the whole world that I think making conclusions about that is too premature.
So it sounds very promising. Is it just that we don't have these cases being reported, or is it just that they just aren't out there?
Yeah, and I think actually maybe some of the best evidence that we have that they're very uncommon is IDEXX Laboratories, which is a veterinary laboratory group, have been testing banked samples from dogs, cats, and horses since the beginning of the pandemic. And they've tested thousands and thousands of animals that have had samples submitted for other respiratory illnesses, for testing for other respiratory infectious diseases. And they've had extremely low numbers. Almost all of those tests have been negative.
I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the role that pets play in our human health and how the health of pet and owner are related. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because we've got, a lot of evidence out there that pet ownership is really beneficial for human health. It has benefits for psychological health. It's actually been shown to decrease blood pressure, reduced cardiac illness in elderly, all sorts of positive benefits like that. Kids that have pets, that grow up with pets, have better self-esteem. Lots of studies in the literature looking at the benefits of pet ownership. And of course, there's been concern that people would abandon animals because of fear that they could spread COVID-19. And actually, again, we have no evidence for that. But the good news is right now in this country, at least, adoptions are way up because of people being home, and they want companionship. And actually, it's quite difficult to get a new puppy in at this time from shelters, just because the demand is so high.
We have another question. Stuart from Facebook is asking, can COVID-19 be passed between humans and dogs through flea or tick bites?
There's no evidence for that. I think that would be unlikely.
Yeah, there's none of the coronaviruses have been shown to be vector-borne. So there are plenty of RNA viruses that are vector-borne, but coronaviruses are not among those. And that's true of all the coronaviruses.
Let's see. Rihanna from Facebook is asking, how would getting the general flu vaccine help with COVID? I guess that's more of a human question, but how would that help?
So I can probably, attempt to address that one, but, I think we've learned with COVID-19 that comorbidities are important risk factors for severe disease. And it's likely that, getting flu is going to reduce your defenses, and co-infections with influenza and SARS coronavirus 2 could result in more severe outcomes than just single SARS coronavirus 2 infections.
Yeah, that seems to be
Go ahead, please.
that seems to be a major worry of public health, is what's going to happen during flu season. As Jane says, these viruses, they play on each other. Virus infections open you up for secondary bacterial infections. One virus can open you up for another. So it is a worry, and people are very worried about what's going to happen during flu season.
A lot of the symptoms overlap as well. So somebody might get the flu if they don't get vaccinated, and they might think they have COVID, and then it kind of puts a lot of strain on the public health system.
Yeah, and you also have to remember that 25% of the colds that are caused during the wintertime are caused by one of 4 species of coronaviruses that already exist in people and have been in existence for some time. So coronaviruses are part of the winter cold season, just like flu. And that has to be remembered too. And so there's even debate on that, whether exposure to the known coronaviruses that cause colds, does that make it worse when you get exposure to COVID, or does it make it better? In other words, do you get cross protection, or do you get cross enhancement? And so that's another kind of unknown factor. We talk about flu all the time, but we forget all these cold viruses that are coronaviruses.
There's been some interesting observations made as well, though, relating to influenza. And when we all went into lockdown at the beginning of the pandemic, the flu season abruptly ended in the United States. And so some feel that the flu season this year might not be as severe, just because people are distancing and they're taking precautions and wearing masks. And also there's not the air travel that normally exists that brings infections from the southern hemisphere up into the northern hemisphere. So that's just an interesting perspective and may influence the flu season as we move forward.
We are going to have to wrap up for time, but just to wrap up briefly, apart from the virus itself, what are the psychological effects when people are spending more time with their pets, as many people are doing right now, sheltering at home? What are the effects? I'm sure there are many positive ones. Maybe there's some negative ones as well.
Yeah, I think if you look at pets as, to some people, as being child or family members or child substitutes, I think you're going to see all of the good and the bad points that we see with our human associations. I mean, some of us are getting tired of our children and some of us are loving it. So I think we're going to see the same thing with our pets. Living too close can be a problem as well as a blessing.
And I think looking at, go ahead, please.
I would agree. What I would say from a, maybe a little bit of a negative impact in some respects. I mean, it's good for veterinary business, but we are pretty tapped out in veterinary clinical operations right now, and there's increasing demand for veterinary support, and that's very challenging given the restrictions associated with COVID and people being out of work and distancing, and that can be challenging. There's a lot of veterinary clinics out there that have developed new receiving practices. For example, they do car-side receiving, and they're looking at animals only in the hospital, and they're not bringing clients into their practices. We're doing that at the teaching hospital at UC Davis. But it is very challenging, and our emergency services are very in demand at the moment.
And I would imagine that as things hopefully get closer to back to normal, and maybe people are spending more time out of their homes, I would imagine that there would be a lot of kind of transitioning to that different way of life for both the human and the pet, not being able to spend as much time. I mean,
a little bit concerned about abandonment when people do get back to work and then they can no longer support pet care. So so hopefully that won't happen, but certainly it could be, it has the potential.
Well, this has been really great. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your work and knowledge. Jane Sykes is Chief Veterinary Medical Officer at UC Davis's Veterinary Medical Teaching Hospital and also an Associate Dean at the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. And Niels Peterson is Professor Emeritus in the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. Until next time, I'm Satirius Johnson. This is UC Davis Live, COVID-19.
Hey, hey.